So I just want to say thanks for being here. This is going to be the official introduction. So you're here for the workshop 1 of this series, and this one is called Creating Emergent Spaces for Sexual Violence Prevention During COVID-19. And I'm Mo from NSVRC, also here with Tori from Prevent Connect. And I also want to read out this little blurb disclaimer. So I want to let you know this publication was supported by the grant or cooperative agreement number, all these numbers. Do you read the numbers? You can read it there. And this is funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention or the Department of Health and Human Services. So yeah, from this point on, we are recording. So just keep that in mind, knowing that this will go on YouTube and be viewable from other people in the future.
Thanks, Mo, and we're super excited to have all of you joining us today. We do have some objectives for our time together today, and our guests will walk you through all of these in a minute. So our guests will describe the core elements of emergent spaces. They will help identify examples of how the core elements of emergent spaces can help prevent sexual violence. You'll also describe strategies to create emergent spaces virtually, since that's where we're at right now. That's where we're at for the foreseeable future too. And then we'll also have an opportunity to discuss opportunities for connection, community, and leading with shared values in creating emergent spaces. So Mo and I really wanted to, take a moment and talk about why and how we got here. This really frames a lot of our series in the next few web conferences that we'll spend together too. So, right now, there's a lot of grief that people are holding, a lot of fear too. This is a scary and uncertain time for a lot of people. And especially the timing of this web conference coming right around a really busy holiday season for people too, where, this is the first time that any of us have ever dealt with anything like this. So we know it's affecting all of us personally on an individual level. And we also recognize the ways that this pandemic is impacting sexual violence survivors and the prevention of sexual violence too. So we really want to hold a space where we can talk about the ways that the COVID-19 pandemic landscape is impacting us and our work, is impacting how we do our work, and impacts, how receptive people are to our work and to the messages of sexual violence prevention. We also recognize that compounding crises that we're going through right now call attention to the need to sustain sexual violence prevention in really meaningful ways. So violence is not inevitable ever, and that we can prevent violence during this pandemic. Mo, I'm going to put the links to these articles in the text chat. Is there anything that you wanted to add here for folks as we go into this conversation?
Yeah, I just think that, I don't know, I just want to acknowledge that it's a hard time for me personally, and I think a lot of other folks that I know are kind of going through it right now. So, that's cool. You can show up here however you are. And I think another thing about this pandemic is that it is really highlighting all of the inequities that exist in these larger systems in terms of like healthcare, social determinants of health, how different groups of people are being impacted differently by this pandemic. And I think that that's something that I think hopefully we've always kind of known about, but I think it's becoming so much more stark and so much more clear. And so, it's just, I think, something to keep in mind that this is just one pandemic of many that are happening right now. So yeah, I don't think I have a fancy way of saying it, but yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah. And we don't need to be fancy. We can just show up, be here with each other and have a conversation about how this is impacting us and our work and impacting our communities too. That being said, we want to take a moment and be really transparent with all of you about where we're coming from with this conversation and the conversations we'll be having in this series. So a paradigm of prevention that has been around for a while and that stems from grassroots organizing, but it comes a little bit closer to home in our current landscape, looks at the value of connection to preventing violence, as well as valuing people as their whole selves. And we want to model and share in that integrity with you all in this space too. We recognize that shared humanity is at the core of our work. We value flexibility, grace for ourselves and others, and we value people as their whole selves, not just what they have to offer for content or their quote unquote professionalism. And that term is something that our guests are going to talk about a little bit more in depth later. These times are really isolating and really stressful. And we strive to create an environment where people are valued beyond their work for who they are as a whole person. We're more than our deliverables. We work from machines, we come to your space from a machine, but we are not machines. We are wholly imperfect humans, and so is everybody else who's logged on to the web conference today. We have been trained and socialized in a culture in ways that when we're only interacting with each other online, it can be difficult to remember that we're all people on the other sides of our screens and outside of our 9-to-5s. And that's something that's coming up a lot in my personal social media lately as we're wrapping up the end of the year. People are like, what have you accomplished in 2020? And then people are also saying, if all you've accomplished in 2020 is surviving, that is a huge accomplishment and a huge feat. We have such a grind and productivity culture that sometimes we lose the humanity that's behind all of that too. What our guests will cover today will touch on a lot of these themes and offer support for how we can honor wholeness and connection in our work to prevent sexual violence while also meeting flexible objectives. And I want to hand it off to Mo to talk a little bit more about this web conference series that this session is a part of.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, we're all really excited about this web conference series. And I don't know, it's weird to put together something like this in the middle of a pandemic because we don't really know what's gonna happen. I mean, we have some ideas of where things are headed, but in terms of the impacts, like social impacts, economic impacts, health impacts, I mean, we just don't really know. So we also are not sure as well how the prevention landscape will change from now until then, until like the end of the pandemic, when that will end too. It's all really uncertain. And like what sorts of things will change in our like post-COVID world, you know, like what are the changes that we're going to be keeping from the work that we're doing now and the changes that we're making now. So our hope really is that these web conferences and this whole series can be a place for like conversation, talking, sharing with each other about what we can do right now to prevent violence in this moment, and then help us also anticipate these kinds of necessary innovations in preventing sexual violence down the road. So I can keep talking if you go to the next slide, Tori. This is really why we wanted to talk about Emergent Space and Emergent Strategy as like this kind of starting point for us. So Tori just shared a link for the book. This is a book that, I mean, I read it and it really changed my life. It changed the way that I think about this work and the way I think about prevention in connection to other movements, and also like myself in connection to other people and communities. I really recommend it personally. So we know that connection is really key for not only prevention program effectiveness, but also as a protective factor. So within prevention, you know, this connection is so important in terms of being protected and protective. So we wanted to really have the key themes from this web conference shape how we view and explore all of the rest of the conversations in this series. So this is why we're having this first, to kind of give ourselves like this framing, this grounding, as a place where we can kind of start and build from together. We're also hoping that there will be actionable ideas that people can hopefully apply today across a variety of spaces. I really like the emergent space that we'll be talking about later. And I feel like, oh, every time I hear about it, I'm like, yes, there's a thing that I can put in my work and think about using right now and try using now. So yeah, if there are any questions at any point, pop them in the chat. We're still kind of getting started, and I know we're going to do another poll, right, Tori?
Yes.
Okay, so this poll, we're really wondering, just like as a starting point, have you heard of Emergent Strategy before the web conference? So Emergent Strategy is a concept that's been around for a while, and I think Adrienne Maree Brown has really made it more popular with these ideas of emergent strategies based on Octavia Butler's work and writings. So, oh, this is great. You're all really quick to vote. I'm seeing a lot of folks just haven't heard about it yet, in which case I will say you're going to be hopefully very delighted by this. It's really cool stuff. Some folks have read the book. I'm seeing a good amount of that clicking up. Some folks are familiar but haven't read the book yet. And then some folks have maybe heard of it but haven't really gotten into it or studied it or read the book. Oh yeah, I see someone in the chat has started the book but not finished it. That was me for a long time. I was like, well, that's cool. I think the book is made to be kind of picked up and put down and utilized and come back to and revisited. I also am kind of a nerd and have been part of a book club for it, and also a learning cohort where we based all of our learning around the book and shaped it that way. So I'm like real deep into it. It looks like almost everybody has participated yet. So I'm gonna close the poll and share the results with everybody. So yeah, the majority of folks yet have not heard about Emergent Strategy before this web conference. So you are in for a real treat. And let's see, stop sharing the results. Okay, here's me just narrating every single thing I'm doing out loud. That's okay. Now I get the pleasure of introducing the folks who are going to be kind of walking us through this and sharing more about Emergent Space. So I'm going to introduce Christy, and then Christy can introduce the other presenters. So Christy is one of my colleagues who works at the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And Christy is the Prevention Education Program Manager there. Hey, Christy.
Hi, Mo. Thanks for having us on today. I'm going to introduce myself and then introduce you to Mantia and Shireen and let them tell you just a little bit about themselves. And then I'm going to share a little bit about how we started this project. So my name's Christy Croft. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the Prevention Education Program Manager at the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So I provide training and technical assistance around sexual violence prevention to all of the rape crisis centers in North Carolina and to a lot of our statewide initiatives. And I'm going to let Shireen and Mantia introduce themselves. They were my interns over the summer through this amazing program called the Moxie Scholars Program out of UNC Chapel Hill, which is a scholarship and internship program for bright students who've done work in women's and gender studies to get a social justice placement over the summer. And they are amazing. So Shireen, do you want to tell us a little about yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Christy, for introducing me. And thank you, Mo and Tori, for holding this space. I'm so excited to be here and so glad to be here. So thank you for everyone for tuning in today. My name is Shireen and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a senior at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm actually studying political science, public policy, but as Christy mentioned, I did a lot of studies of women's and gender studies and different other studies throughout UNC, which kind of landed me at NC CASA. And from then on, it was kind of like just a lot of miracle working then from that point on. But I do want to give a shout out to my coach, actually, who is in the audience, Caress. Hey, Caress. I want to shout her out because she's actually the person who introduced me to Emergent Strategy and had me read the book over the summer. And as everyone has said so far, Emergent Strategy changed the way I thought about things. And it's really what led to us kind of thinking about Emergent Strategy and how to apply it to spaces, especially spaces that I had been in before when it comes to student organizations at UNC, and thinking about how to, use that for violence prevention spaces, but also peer education and thinking about how to apply it. So I'm so glad that we can hold this space today, and I'm excited to introduce our co-author, Mantia.
Mantia, are you able to unmute?
Sorry, y'all. 1 second. I think Montia might have accidentally gotten kicked off the platform. So let me find her again and make her a co-host.
Sure.
She can hopefully unmute herself now.
There we go.
Hi,
Thank
y'all.
you, Tori.
Thank you. Thank you, Tori, Christy, and Shireen for introducing me. And thank you for holding this space. Apologize for the technical difficulties. My name is Montia. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a women's and gender studies and media and journalism double major. I'm from Greenville, North Carolina. I go to UNC Chapel Hill. Me and Shireen met through the class for Moxie Scholarship, and being able to meet together and talk together, it was the beginning of a really great collaboration. And I'm really glad that we had Christy as a mentor and being able to learn so much over the summer. And we had a really great time just coming up with this and learning from it and learning from each other and really setting the ground for what Emergent Space was by doing it ourselves. So I'm really glad we can hold this space and be able to tell y'all about this project.
Thank you. And so their summer internship project that is still in the works was a product for North Carolina's teachers and school staff and administrators on how to create safer school environments for LGBTQ students as a violence prevention strategy. And so they did a lot of work, but one of the things we struggled with was how to create a space in which LGBTQ students could feel safe and like they wouldn't be harmed in the classroom, while recognizing that especially in rural parts of North Carolina, there may be students in the class who don't know that they've ever met an LGBTQ person or may have been raised with some misunderstandings. And so how do we create a space where they can also feel safe learning? And we kept going back and forth between safe and brave spaces and which framework we wanted to use. And at some point I just said, well, we don't have to use one of these. Why don't we create our own framework? Y'all are brilliant. Let's make up your own framework. And they came back to me as we were thinking what to call this growth-oriented framework that fosters people's ability to be both brave while feeling safe. They came up with the idea to call it Emergent Space because they were both reading Emergent Strategy over the summer. And as they mentioned, just having their minds blown by it. And so this project emerged out of our LGBTQ youth and student safety project as a side project. And it was brilliant. I was so proud of the work that they did. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Montia and head on to the next slide and let her start sharing with you about it.
Thank you, Christy. So we thought about, like Christy was saying, like safe spaces and brave spaces, and thinking about the different pros and cons of these. We made like a Venn diagram thinking about what is a safe space, what is a brave space, what are the good things about both of these frameworks. So we talked about how a safe space is kind of like bubble wrap, and it kind of puts like bubble wrap around the conversation and didn't allow for the conversation to have difficult conversations and things like that. And then brave space, we saw it as something that was a little too head on, and it made the person wanting to share have to share regardless of if the space was safe or not. So we wanted to see what you guys thought about safe spaces and brave spaces, and what are the things that you wanted to, that you've seen in both of those spaces, and some of the pros and cons that you guys have seen.
So definitely feel free to share some of the pros and cons you've seen in each of those frameworks. When we came to our third alternative, our new alternative, which is the Emergent Strategy, Emergent Space alternative, as I said, we were inspired by Adrienne Maree Brown's Emergent Strategy, which is on our next slide. Shireen?
Yeah, so we just want to shout out Adrienne Maree Brown again one more time, just because obviously this framework that she put out is really what inspired us and is really what gave us the foundational elements too of Emergent Space, and they both mirror each other. And you'll hear later that one of the last elements of Emergent Strategy and also Emergent Space is this idea of creating more possibilities. And so with Emergent Strategy, which originally came out of Octavia Butler's work, we're now creating more work as our own team, and hopefully y'all will also come out of this conference thinking of more possibilities too of how you can build on these frameworks and on this work even more. But we also just wanted to share with y'all that Adrienne Maree Brown has a new book coming out next April, which we are so excited about, and it's called Holding Change: the way of emergent strategy, facilitation, and mediation. So definitely be sure to check that out. It's coming in April 2021.
Perfect. And I'm noting some of the comments in the chat are bringing up exactly some of the comments that we had in creating this space, like the idea of safer spaces. Safe spaces can feel performative, but one of the challenges we've seen with the Brave Space model, it seems like a lot of y'all are familiar with some of the challenges around safe spaces. Some of the challenges we had with the Brave Space model is seeing people implementing it in the absence of any sort of social justice lens or awareness of oppression, and then using it in a way that it wasn't originally intended, and sort of weaponizing it against people to say things like, toughen up, Snowflake, this is a brave space, you have to share. And so after seeing both of those, which have really great foundational concepts, but that get used and implemented in unusual ways, we wanted to come up with something that sort of brought together the best of each. And so these students, Shireen and Mantia, who are y'all, I just think they're brilliant. I've learned so much from them. They decided to look at the principles of emergent strategy and see how we would apply those to a safe and brave, or a new emergent space framework. So Mantia, did you want to maybe tell us some on the next slide about the principles?
Yeah, definitely. The first principle of emergent strategy is that it has a fractal nature. And as we'll see, we'll go through all of these different principles in more depth and being able to talk about them more. But a fractal nature, it acknowledges the relationship between things that are small and large. So like individual to the community. It's also adaptive and ever changing. You can change emergent spaces and emergent strategy and fit it towards whatever space that you need it to. And it emphasizes interdependence and decentralization, specifically decentralization of voices that we hear a lot and centralizing voices that are marginalized. It is nonlinear and iterative, so you can go back to different things in the conversation. It fosters resilience and opportunities for transformative justice, which is one of my favorite ones, and we'll get into that a lot later, and how that is really important for these spaces and being able to grow in them. And it continues to create more possibilities. Like Shireen was saying, like we got emergent space out of emergent strategy, and we'll be able to continue to make more things, and we hope that more things will be created out of emergent space.
Thank you so much, Mantia. So the first fractal element is fractals. And so I love this picture because I feel like it really helps me think about fractals in a more visual way. Essentially, fractals themselves are never-ending patterns that are similar across different scales. So we can think about fractals in different levels. So individuals, we can think about interpersonal relationships, communities, and society. And we can think about how each individual has an impact on the larger society that they're in. We have scaled impacts everywhere we go. So that means that in emergent spaces, we can adapt ourselves to any group or any size, and that even an individual, we can still have impact in the communities around us. And you can kind of see this in this kaleidoscope nature, as everything is codependent, and even the individuals have a specific role that essentially adds to the greater community. And so we're all kind of working together, even though there's impact happening at every level. Next slide, please.
And emergent spaces are also adaptive. Just like the phase of the moon, it's always changing. We just had a new moon, if any of y'all are into astrology. And emergent spaces invites change, as they could provide a space for growth and learning. And the facilitators in an emergent space are encouraged to remain responsive to these changes, the different pacing and the different content as new needs and challenges arise in that moment. So the group members are also adaptive and based on each other's needs, and every level of the community adapts based on the constant flow of communication and care between other levels of the community. So the individual is also supporting the community the same way the community is supporting the individual, and they're each adapting to each other's needs in time. Next slide, please.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the next element, which is the emphasis on interdependence and decentralization. And it happens to also be one of my favorite elements of emergent strategy and also emergent spaces. And essentially, interdependence and decentralization is exactly what it says, is to decentralize our actions. And what I've noticed and what I found, and I think a lot of what Mantia and Christy and I's conversation surrounded was surrounded around was the fact that there's so much hierarchy sometimes. When we think about how we've come to organize ourselves, whether that be in student organizations, I see that a lot in student groups. We always have exec boards and different structural hierarchies, and we institutionalize a lot of these hierarchies, and that can make a lot of voices be left out. And so a lot of folks were even talking about marginalized folks in the chat, which I saw. And I'm so glad to be seeing that, because that's literally the reason why Monty and I actually really came together and started talking about this, because we thought about our own identities and we thought about our own experiences as marginalized folks and marginalized students, and thought about how that was affecting how we move through spaces and how we experience different spaces. And so a lot of the time, especially when thinking about hierarchies often can leave a lot of folks out, like I said. And rather than having a centralized structure, decentralization allows for more folks to contribute to a space. And it also allows for more folks to have responsibility over a space. And when folks have responsibility over a space, then more change and more impact can actually occur. And folks are also supposed to be more willing to take accountability for causing harm and perpetuating harm, if harm is actually to occur in those spaces. Next slide, please.
And emergent spaces are also nonlinear and iterative. So just the way that growth is not a linear process and it's fluid and cyclical, and healing is not a linear process, emergent spaces are also not linear. So periodically in the conversation, you can revisit earlier discussions with a focus on integrating the lessons learned, ensuring that participants have the opportunities not to just learn from a concept, but to continuously practice it and compare it to their past beliefs and practices. So it's about being able to go back into the conversation, about being able to merge all of our ideas, merge all of these beliefs and practices that we're creating and learning and incorporating into our own personal growth. And the linear expectations for group trajectory are continually revisited, reshifted, and revised throughout the process based on the evolving needs, interests, and expectations of the group. So you're allowed to go back into the conversation 3 slides ago and be able to talk about the things in order to learn from it, grow from it, and be able to incorporate it and practice it. Next slide, please.
So the next element, which is super, super important, and again, we've mentioned previously, so I'm excited to actually be delving into this a little bit more, which is the idea of fostering resilience and opportunities for transformative justice. And so this is especially important when we're thinking about our marginalized communities and marginalized folks, such as people of color and LGBTQ+ folks in our spaces, because we don't want to cause harm. And we're also thinking about survivors of violence as well. And a lot of these identities intersect and often compound, which can lead to certain risk factors and people getting harmed in spaces, which is what we want to move away from. And so in moving away from it, we already have these brilliant frameworks of transformative justice, which might move us away from the traditional punitive measures such as police, prisons, and government, which may not be addressing individual harm. A lot of the time, those things or systems even perpetuate harm or only address the legality. But we also want to think about focusing on the human side and the humanity aspect of survivorship and all the other identities that may come with that as well. So thinking of transformative justice and making sure that our work is centered in that is so important. Next slide, please. Yes, and Christy also mentioned in the chat, y'all, just to chime in real quick to add any of your favorite transformative justice resources in the chat box. That's so important. I love sharing resources, and especially when it comes to transformative justice, I'm all about it. And especially with this framework in particular, one thing that we always like to mention is the importance of self-work. And a lot of us had to do a lot of self-work to be able to even start these conversations and hold these spaces, to be able to understand systems before we even enter them in order to prevent that harm from happening. So thanks, Christy, for making sure that folks are sharing those resources in the chat.
Thank you, Shireen. And yeah, and emergent spaces continue to create more possibilities. So just like Adrienne Maree Brown built this framework out of Emergent Strategy and built these framework out of the ideas of Octavia Butler, we built our framework of emergent spaces out of the work of Adrienne Maree Brown. So this group will continue to adapt to the principles for new and varied uses in your agencies, classrooms, and communities. And we hope that there's more comes out of emergent space and that we can continue to grow and create using it.
Thank you both so much for walking us through all of these principles. It's definitely giving me a lot of ideas about what I can be doing differently to create more possibilities in the spaces that I'm in and that I interact with too. And folks are adding a lot of really, really great examples of transformative justice resources. And I'm so excited to look through some of those later. Lots of love for Beyond Survival, love with accountability, creative interventions too. So in addition to please keep those coming, we want to hear more about the resources that are resonating with you all. We also want to have you all take a moment, reflect, and respond to what do you plan to do to create more possibilities in the space you exist in, reflecting back on what Montia and Shireen have just shared with you. And as you all are answering that, we're going to keep going. So while you're responding, I want to hand it back over to Montia and Shireen. Can you tell us more about the key concepts of emergent spaces?
Yeah, so one of the key concepts of emergent space is conflict, because we know in any space that conflict can arise from any number of reasons, and we want to be able to be prepared and how to approach conflict in these spaces. So starting off with counterproductive conflict, it has being right or proving that the other person is wrong as its goal and ideals. It also loses sight of collaboration. It doesn't allow participants, particularly those with marginalized identities, to feel seen and heard. And it's not solution oriented. So I think of counterproductive conflict as focusing on our ego, focusing on what we want to be right, focusing on we want to be the bigger person and being able to take up more space. And then that is not allowing other people to have their voices heard and also isn't working towards a solution in the space. So counterproductive conflict is what we don't want to see in spaces, but we want to see more generative conflict.
Right. Thank you so much, Montia, for going over counterproductive conflict. And a lot of the conflict, I think, is normalized a lot of the time in our spaces. And at least from what I've experienced is the kind of conflict I see. I like that you mentioned the fact that conflict is somewhat inevitable just because we all have different ideas sometimes and everyone's bringing different things to the table. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. And actually, conflict can lead to a lot of growth if we do it in a generative way. So rather than being right or trying to prove others wrong, instead, generative conflict would look like holding repair and growth as its ideals. Also, generative conflict is solution oriented. So folks are collaborating towards a greater understanding, whether that be towards equity or violence prevention. And rather than thinking about, okay, how am I going to be right? Or how am I going to prove that other person wrong? That's not the goal of the space. We all have a specific goal in the space, and that's what makes it generative. And lastly, it's solution oriented. So thinking of our solution being the goal rather than goals of, like Montia mentioned, which might be driven by ego, like I want to be right or proving others wrong. So thinking about how we can move away from counterproductive conflict into generative conflict is super, super important in all the spaces that we hold. Next slide, please.
And one of the key concepts of emergent space is accessibility. So when we were creating this framework, we were thinking about the ways that people show up to a space, and then also thinking about how can people even get to the space, what things need to be in place so people can show up and be their best selves in the space. So we thought about things like, what time is the meeting? Is it during other activities that are focused on equity? Is it at the time where other people are working or otherwise engaged? Also, is it wheelchair, blind, deaf, accessible in this area or format? Me and Shireen go to UNC, so there's a lot of buildings on campus that are not wheelchair accessible and not blind accessible, not deaf accessible. And we want to make sure that we are moving our spaces and making sure that we have our spaces in places where people who are blind, deaf, or use wheelchairs can come and be able to show up. And did you consider language accessibility? There's one really cool thing I've seen on Zoom lately that I didn't see throughout my classes was that you can change the language on your Zoom and being able to have like a language translator for people on Zoom. So I think that's really important so we can make sure that we're not leaving people out of these conversations. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so important. Thank you, Montia. I think sometimes it can be easy, especially if we have certain privileges. Like for me, for example, I'm able-bodied, so I don't often have to think about, do I need closed captioning, or, do I need a specific accessible entrance somewhere? And those are really important things to think about. I mean, we're in a virtual space, which actually gives us some really cool tools that we can see here, such as the closed captioning. But when we're also returning to physical spaces, hopefully eventually, it's also important to think about accessibility. So thanks, Montia, for going over that. Another thing we can think about, especially when we're thinking about public health and violence prevention, is just evaluation in general. And so evaluation can still take place in emergent spaces. And so establish a plan for process and outcome evaluation. So process evaluation essentially is reflecting and documenting how you implemented your emergent space, and outcome evaluation means collecting the information after, thinking about and reflecting after you've held that space. Did the space meet the goals that I wanted it to? Did we learn something? Was it fluid? Did it match the elements, et cetera, et cetera? So at different points in time, you can evaluate and reflect on your emergent spaces or whatever spaces you're trying to hold, and see what growth you have, and then make changes. Because again, this process is so fluid and it can change at any time, and it's adaptable. And so can your evaluation. So can your evaluation be, exactly. So next slide, thank you.
Thank you both so much for walking through those key concepts. You're getting a lot of comments in the chat about how important accessibility is, and how people really appreciate you all walking us through all of that. Before we talk about the group process and stages, we did get a lot of folks responding to our text chat question about what they plan to do to create more possibilities in the spaces they exist in. So I'm going to share some of the themes that I saw come up, and then Mo, if you saw anything too, please feel free to chime in. I want to read Amber's response. Working in a very rural, poor, conservative, politically and religiously area, Amber finds herself needing to move forward with invitation rather than confrontation as it is traditionally known and used. I think that's such an important takeaway to creating these spaces. And I saw a lot of other themes of collaboration, being intentional with budgeting time, as well as language access. Mo, did you find anything about any other themes from our last text chat question you want to bring out?
You took my themes, Tori. That's okay. I thought it was really great. I loved how people were sharing about their personal experiences and the places where they're working. And I just want to second that thing about like budgeting enough time. And then a couple of things that were coming up just recently was about accessibility, and how sometimes different things that you might need for access or for creating something that's more accessible, those also cost money too. And so that just kind of flips something in my head about how do we budget our time and how do we budget our money and stuff. So yeah, it's lots of good stuff happening in the chat.
Great, thank you. And just answering this out loud because I was mid-typing it. The chat will be saved and shared. You all will also receive an email when that is available online. But Christy, I think you have a little something else to say about evaluation, and then we'll move on to the group process.
Sure. I saw someone asked in the chat if we have any evaluation tools, and we don't. But we have given some thought and talked with NC CASA's program evaluator to sort of brainstorm how to bring these principles into our evaluation. And it might mean that just as with the planning, the first several sessions of your program is going to be building the container and building that space and building that connection and creating that invitation, you want to allow for that in your evaluation. So you might do something like, as part of bringing your group together, revise or collaboratively create some of what your objectives are going to be, so that it's a group process to do that. That might be actually one of your steps is collaboratively creating your logic model components. It also might mean things like working into your evaluation plan, periodically revisiting your logic model and your evaluation plan itself so that it's a living document. and can grow along with what the group is collaboratively creating. So an example of that, that comes to my mind is if you start with one set of objectives in your logic model and you create your evaluation plan off of that, and then over the course of hosting an emergent space with your collaborative group process, those objectives start to shift, or the group begins to have new values that are leading the work that you're doing, then you want to periodically be able to revisit what those objectives are and how you're going to measure them, because not doing your original objectives wouldn't necessarily reflect a failure of the group if you're continually being adaptive and responsive to where the group is taking you. So what comes up for us when we think about evaluation is building the principles into your evaluation plan to make sure that you don't set something up that's so rigid that it has no space to be emergent in practice.
Christy, you just provided such a great lead into what Montia and Shireen are going to talk about on the next slide with the group processes and stages too.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having that good lead in, Christy. So group processes and stages is very cyclical. So when you begin, you develop the agreements, you build trust, and you basically go through all of the different things that you want to be able to talk about in that space. So this is where the self-work begins. As Shireen was talking about before, we emphasize self-work a lot in this process and a lot in Emergent Space because we have to do a lot of the self-work in order to show up as our best selves in the space, in order to have the knowledge and to be able to interact well with people in the space. So we develop those agreements. It may look something like a social contract. It may look something like a verbal agreement, and being able to build the trust between the people in the relationship. And that sets the stage for implementing. And this is where you are norming and performing and practicing emergent spaces. So when in norming and performing, we're allowing ourselves to basically talk about the things that we want to and be able to understand each other and listen to each other based off of the trust and agreements we built, and then making that a normal part of the conversation and making it a normal part of Emergent Space. So I feel like a lot of times when we try something new and we're beginning the process, it can feel weird at first. And this norming and performing is making sure that everyone feels comfortable with it and we're okay with using these words, okay with being able to talk about these different things. And in closing, we want to process the experience and also analyze the next steps in the new spaces that we'll be a part of. So processing the experience can look like a debrief and debriefing the experience. And for the next steps in new spaces, we also want to consider some of the other key concepts we talked about before, and being able to make sure the space is accessible. And in processing the experience, we want to make sure we are evaluating ourselves and seeing, was that conflict a generative conflict, and thinking about things like that. And then once we go all the way back into the new space, you begin that process again. I know it may sound strange, beginning the process again, even if it's with the same people, but it's still wanting to develop that trust and build that trust and develop these agreements so that we can continue to have a smooth process throughout an emergent space. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you. That was so informative to walk through that iterative nonlinear process and help kind of break out of some habits we've been stuck in with just going along like it's a one-way train track when it's not. Mo, I understand we have a question for the audience. Do you want to let folks in on that?
Yes, I do. So we're really curious to hear back from you all how you can build emergence into some of these more programmatic pieces like grant writing, evaluation, and prevention program planning. Christy, I know you were talking just a little bit earlier about some of these ideas for building emergence into evaluation. And I was just wondering if you had anything else to share about building in that emergence to any of these other programmatic aspects.
Sure. And I know that everybody on here might have some really good ideas that they could share in the chat box. I know what's coming up for me is sometimes the way we have to write grants is not set up to convey some of this. And so that's where we kind of look at the difference between what we've written to submit for the grant and how we're going to implement it. And so maybe finding ways to check our boxes. All of us who do this work are familiar with the fact that sometimes we find ways to make sure we're checking the right boxes because we know that we need to do that to be in integrity with our grants. And we also know that what we've checked on the boxes isn't the only thing we do or the only way we do it, that we can have that flexibility and adaptivity in the implementation. I wanted to mention, so that I don't get in trouble for joking about checking boxes, that I'm so excited that North Carolina's RPE contact at the CDC is on this web conference with us right now. So yes, I do check all the boxes. And also, I think that it's obvious, even in my conversations with my CDC contact, Melissa, who's on the call now, that her heart is in this work too, you know, so finding ways to have conversations with your funders to make sure that we're clear that we're trying to meet the right requirements and be in integrity with how we use the money. And we also are real people doing this work in a creative way. And I know that like our funders have been super supportive of us holding space for our humanity and the humanity of the staff that we're providing TA to and the humanity of the clients and communities that we're working in.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Christy. I think it's so important to think about how do we build that responsivity into the boxes that we check and the ways in which we check them, because you know those are things that are really important to our funders, and we want to make sure that we're having those open lines of communications with our funders, as you had talked about with folks that you work with, as well as just having that responsivity and adaptability as a key part of Emergence. And I know I see some folks are responding in ways that they're building Emergence into grant writing, evaluation, and program planning in the chat. That's awesome. I encourage you all to think about that a little bit more and add to the chat, but we're going to move forward. Montia, what are the considerations for applying emergent spaces in a virtual, physically distanced space like we're in now and like folks are probably going to be in for a while during the COVID-19 pandemic?
So thank you, Tori. So emergent spaces can be used and created virtually and in person. So it's about the connections between us, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be in person in order to make that connection. We can make that connection in a virtual space. So it's about the communities we build together, not the building, not the medium or the format, unless we're talking about making it accessible. So the communities that we are a part of are fractal in nature, and it goes from the individual to the community, but the community is also made up of individuals who can network and connect and also find these new and different ways in order to make an emergent space. And it also can sometimes be accessible when you have a virtual format, because it eliminates the need for the need for the building. It eliminates the need for like necessarily the place where you have it at. So we can make sure that people are able to connect even from across the globe. There's so many different places where people are from in this community right here that we're building, and we're all able to be here through a virtual format. And so the idea of emergent space was also created in an online and a virtual environment. So we created Emergent Space this summer while we were in the Moxie internship, and it was all online, and it was a whole completely virtual process, but we were still able to create that space through the conversations that we were having, through the honest conversations that we were having, and being able to talk to each other and communicate and showing support in ways that didn't necessarily like require to be in person, but showing support in ways that were virtual and also made us feel like we could be in community with each other. And so we also want to recognize that a lot of us right now are building this connection in order to reduce the isolation between us. It can be like definitely especially for me at the beginning of the pandemic, it felt very isolating because you couldn't be in contact with anybody anymore. I was away from home, and it was like a lot harder to find community. But and through virtual spaces, I felt like I was able to talk to people more and be able to collaborate and understand in a virtual environment. And it helped me feel more connected to the people around me. And the virtual environment can help and foster these inclusive and creative environments amongst people who live in different areas, like I was saying, but also people who come from like different backgrounds and different ways of ways of communicating, and also the way that we interact with each other. I feel like just going back from like my experiences at UNC, there are definitely some places on campus that are like siloed and that are like kind of like out there, and some people just wouldn't go to a certain place just because that's a space that's not for me. And being able to say, oh, well, this is a space for everybody who wants to come to this space right now. We don't have like the historical associations beside the buildings like we do at UNC, and being able to have that, I feel like definitely in my communities at UNC have brought more people into the space. And I think it's very interesting to see that we can all be in community still, even with a virtual space. And so the question is, how do we become intentional about building this connection, and what's good for all of us? And I feel like that's a question that we're all still learning from and all still kind of creating on our own. And we become intentional about building this connection through being intentional about making sure that we're connecting to people. And I feel like we're making sure that we are talking to people and checking up on people and making sure that people are okay during, especially like right now during these very unprecedented times. So that's how we can make this space friendly and virtual, even when it's not in person.
Thanks, Mantia. Next slide. So I know that we have some examples, and I got a few pictures here just to show you of some of the things that we've done inadvertently implementing Emergent Space. I don't think we were even really trying, but I realized in retrospect we were doing a little bit of this. And so an example of this is our North Carolina RPE program and what we've done. And before the pandemic, they got together once a year for an annual meeting, and they might see each other at occasional conferences or events. But at the beginning of the pandemic, we realized our RPE subrecipients were overwhelmed and unsure how to move forward. I don't know if you remember what it felt like in the middle of March when suddenly everything was changing and none of us knew what was coming, and we were afraid and confused and overwhelmed. And I know many of us still are, but it feels different now than it did at the very beginning. And so we started during that time hosting initially weekly, and then they moved to bi-weekly meetings where I would invite all of our subrecipients and their supervisors to come and join us on a support call. And in those first few calls, everyone was so overwhelmed that we honestly spent the first 45 minutes of each 90-minute call just letting them share their personal check-in. How were you holding up? Is everyone staying safe and healthy in your family? Are you okay? Are you okay doing this work? Are you holding up okay? We care about you. And that was the first part. And then we would have conversations about how to pivot and do our prevention work in the new reality that we're in. Now we're at a point where maybe the first half hour is a check-in, and then the second hour is somewhere between a learning share, or we'll do a little bit of training. Something else that's happened is that we've collaboratively developed products together, which we never would have been able to do before bringing this emergence concept into a virtual environment. So what has happened, I know I see Julia, who's in the chat box, mentions those calls have been important and grounding throughout the year. The RPE subrecipients have literally told us that's one of the few calls they look forward to. Even if they're busy, they want to make it to that call. We had conversations earlier where someone had seen a campaign for online safety for youth that was using a whole lot of fear tactics and some victim blaming language. And in our conversations about what kind of messaging we'd like to see, we had a brainstorm, and I took extensive notes and then turned around and converted it into this document that you see on the right called Opening the Dialogue, Helping Youth Stay Safe Online. And it's a document targeted at parents and caregivers that emphasizes things like keeping lines of communication open and, having more of a relational model to it rather than a fear-based or punitive model to how we have these conversations. So they created this document collaboratively, and we got it translated into Spanish. The middle picture is a screenshot from a video that NC CASA is going to be releasing at sometime in December or January. It's almost finished, but that's another thing where they said, here's the video I wish I could see. I don't want to see the video where the kid has no idea what's going on and the parent's really mean to the kid or hides their phone. We want to see the video where they're modeling what to do. So we've made a series of videos where youth get an inappropriate contact through social media. And in one video, they reach out to a parent to have a good conversation. And the parent responds by being like, hey, this is an opportunity. I'm glad you came to me. Let's chat. And the same thing with the screenshot you see here, which is where a kid gets a strange message that doesn't feel right and reaches out to a friend. And so those are going to be available on NC CASA's website as part of our Let's Talk About It campaign. But again, those two videos emerged from my RPE subrecipients in that space, collectively and collaboratively saying, here's what we wish existed. And now we've been able to make it together because we're having regular community building. And that community building is what created the space for the cool things that they are doing. Like if you look in that screenshot on the left, that is from our community building. So there were two things going on in that picture that day of the meeting. One of them is that a few weeks prior, one of our RPE subrecipients announced that he was going to be graduating with his master's, and that it was kind of depressing looking at his cap and gown that he ordered pre-pandemic and wondering I don't even have anywhere to wear it now. And so we told him to wear it to our next RPE subrecipient meeting, and he did. And we all sang to him and clapped for him and cheered him on. And that was also our RPE program manager, Glorina's birthday of that meeting. So she missed the meeting. So we actually recorded ourselves singing like the loudest, most off-key and asynchronous birthday song ever, and laughed and sent her videos, sent her screenshots. So it's kind of like, I feel like we've built community in addition to the professional support that we provide each other. We've built community and connectedness, which has not only reduced our personal isolation, but it's allowed this kind of connection that's just, the results have been remarkable in terms of what happens when we create the space where everybody can come and share that responsibility for creating new things out of it. It's been wonderful. So that's one example of putting it into practice in a way that builds some of that trust to where it's been powerful to the point where we're like, even if the virtual stuff ends and we're all able to go back to doing our work in real time, we're planning to continue these calls because they've been amazing. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Christy, for going over all of that example. And I have great memories of that call specifically. It was definitely great, like just reiterating, the importance of building community and putting humanity first. I think when it comes to building trust, actually holding the space to do that and to even just acknowledge our humanity and acknowledge the people behind the screen or in the space is super, super important. So moving forward, we can think about building these solutions together as they relate to emergent strategy and also creating emergent spaces. And so solutions are created as a result of equitable and decentralized collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, decentralization is one of my favorite elements. And so think about how you can potentially implement decentralization in your own community, in your own organization, in your own individual and personal life, because it can totally happen. And each individual completes or works for a community towards a goal. So thinking about generative conflict, again, thinking about how just like this puzzle, as individuals, we each are different and we each have different things to bring, whether that's lived experiences or different identities, but we can all fit together within a community, bringing our own self-work and our own individual to the space to create a bigger solution or to create something more beautiful, which I think is what we've been doing in this space and what I've had just such the blessed opportunity to do with NC CASA. So definitely thinking about that moving forward. And lastly, thinking about how collectively, when we can contribute ourselves, that we should, and thinking about how more voices in a space are always better than less voices, and thinking about how we can include and center more voices in all of our spaces, thinking about transformative justice and thinking about the importance of centralizing marginalized folks in all of our communities, whether that be in a group session, in a small group think, to a huge organization like the CDC that folks were mentioning. So these spaces can be applied anywhere, literally anywhere, and you can embody emergent strategy anytime in your life on an individual level, and it still have impact on the community around you. Next slide, please.
So one of the things that came up for us after we released this, which we had already pretty much drafted this whole document and had so many conversations about it when we shared it with NC CASA staff. And one of the things that came up for us immediately was, how do we have emergent organizations? How do we create emergent space in our agencies and in our stakeholder committees and teams? How do we do that in our workplaces? And one of the things that came up is this idea of allowing space for people to bring their full selves into their work. And that might mean different things to different people. But when I think about bringing my full self into my work, that means that even when I'm at work, I'm not just defined by my work or my productivity, that I'm allowed to be a full human. And there's some days when, I'm not doing as well. And I'm struggling, especially with this pandemic. I think there's some days where we're all struggling a little bit. And so on the days that that's present for me, I'm able to say that when I'm chatting with my supervisor or a colleague, to say, I'm having a rough time. There's this thing that's going on, so I might be a little bit distracted today, to just kind of acknowledge and name that you're allowed to have feelings, you're allowed to have a family, you're allowed to have community and people who are your chosen family. We are able to bring that into our space, also to follow some of their passions. How do we model those emergent principles in our organizational development and how our agency does our work with survivors? How are we being emergent with survivors and providing that space for them? How are we providing that space for students if we do any kind of K-12 or campus work? How do we do that work with our coworkers and our staff and with our stakeholders? I know my supervisor is on this call, and she has made me smile a few times, because I love it when these ideas that these brilliant students came up with impacts my coworkers. And my supervisor will be dealing with a challenging stakeholder someday and getting frustrated, and she'll say, emergent space, and she'll kind of center herself on thinking about how to bring some of these principles into interactions with challenging community stakeholders. We'll think about modeling trauma-informed workplace practices. And so there might not be a whole lot online about emergent organizations yet, although if y'all want to collaborate with us on creating that document, we're totally down. But there is a lot out there on trauma-informed workplace practices, and there's a lot of overlap between trauma-informed and emergent. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that the professionalization of what had been a grassroots movement has created some things that are beautiful and wonderful for our movement around funding and some of the access that we have. But professionalization of a grassroots movement has also created some limits and rigidity and boundaries that we need to really think critically about. Like, what does it mean to have a field, to deprofessionalize it in a way that we don't need every person doing this work to have an MSW, for example. Not every position at every single agency requires an MSW. I don't have an MSW. What does it mean to have workplace policies that kind of look critically at what we mean by professionalization? Because we also know that a lot of things that we consider to be professional norms are rooted in white supremacy culture and have this long history. So how do we sort of think about which professional norms are actually helping us do our work better and more powerfully and more collaboratively and with more integrity? And which of those professional standards are maybe either irrelevant or causing harm to the way we do our work? So I think that's an important piece of the emergent organization conversation, letting people be themselves in the workplace and acknowledging each other's and our own humanity so that we can grow strong leaders. My supervisor is also always talking about succession planning, and she doesn't mean succession planning as in a replacement for her job. She means for the movement. Like, how do we create spaces for people to grow into the powerful leaders that the anti-violence movement needs? Next slide. And that requires kind of implementing this emergent supervision concept. We can even look at what does emergent supervision look like? This is something I didn't think about until after we produced this document and my coworker Tracy got to know Shireen and Mantia better and to see their work better. And Tracy said, you created an emergent supervision space for them. And I said, I did, because I was just modeling the way that I am supervised. But it makes me think about things like how much flexibility is there in job descriptions, work hours, and flex times. So we all have our deliverables if you're grant funded, but if the deliverables take up 70% of your time, what's that 30% for? I would like to propose that maybe sometimes that 30% can be for dreaming and following passions and having passion projects and, shared community caregiving, like taking care of your people. Your supervisee's brilliance helps your light shine brighter. This is one thing to where I know a lot of times people can be intimidated and it's a trope that we've got to be competitive or scared of someone showing us up. But I disagree entirely. I want these two on this call with me to just like blow everyone's minds today. I kind of feel like they have been a little bit, and that makes me really proud. Think about, is there space to follow their passions? Are we working collaboratively and staying focused on solutions? And are we embracing generative conflict? So think about aligning our values and our emerging strategies between movement, organization, team, and staff. So what I mean by that is, how do we get our staff as individuals to have conversations so that we can understand what our shared values are as a team? And then if we have multiple teams in our organization, how do we communicate and collaborate between teams to make sure we have shared values and some understanding of each other? How do we model with that fractal nature at each layer that we work in, the anti-sexual violence movement, the organization you work for, your statewide team? In my organization itself, I'm on the prevention and special populations team, and there's a member services team. Like, think about aligning values at each of those layers. And then again, conversations about professionalism. What do we mean by professionalism? I show up at work any day that I don't have to be fancy, wearing beat up jeans, beat up Vans, a t-shirt, and a hoodie. And nobody has fussed at me yet, as long as I look reasonably presentable when we're dealing with fancy stakeholders. So think about which things are a necessary part of how we do this work, and which things are things we're doing just because we're trying to impress people, 50 years ago who created these standards. Next slide.
Thank you so much for bringing this back to this hot button word that we've been talking about. What is professionalism? We're all wearing slippers to work now. I think but that's something that maybe it wasn't something we were doing before the pandemic. Those of us who are working from home are probably wearing slippers. So want to really echo some of the appreciation coming through in the chat, that people feel really grateful, feel really heard in the last section that all of you walked through. And we have about 10 minutes of our time left with each other. So we want to give you all a moment to think about, in your role, how can you use emergent spaces in different ways to prevent sexual violence and foster connections? Folks have already been making those connections in the chat, but want to have a bit of a bit more space for people to think about this and respond in the text chat. So as people are responding, and Mo, if there's anything you want to chime into the framing, please do so and interrupt me.
Are you waiting for me to interrupt you?
Sure.
Okay. I don't know. I think this is really great. I mean, I feel like this is just such a lovely way of thinking about some of the really valid critiques about this movement and this field and our work. And it's just such a nice way of thinking about making changes that feel good and feel generative. And I'm seeing that coming through in the chat a lot. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Just really grateful that folks are continuing to share. And as you share, please also put any questions you have for our guests in the chat. For our last 9 minutes here, we do want to bring it back to Montia, Shireen, and Christy and ask you to share some of the valuable lessons learned that you've learned in this process with our audience.
Thank you, Tori. Some of we've learned like a lot of valuable lessons through this project and just being able to work together. I've learned so much from Shireen and Christy. And one of the things that I've learned is the starting at a point of mutual understanding and knowledge is important for collaboration and creating solutions. So we emphasize like the self-work and the doing your readings before coming to the space a lot, because having that point of mutual understanding and knowledge is what allows us to start on the same foot and be able to work together.
Yes, exactly, Montia. Thank you so much. And just like you said, I've learned so much from you too. And I've learned so much from Christy, and we just continue to learn so much about each other. But also in this process, I've learned so much about myself too. So I just think that goes to show how Emergent Spaces is really reflective and really centers our own humanity, but also the humanity of others. And so decentralization, that's another point. I think that's one of the main takeaways for me, is just thinking about decentralization, both again in my own personal life, but also in all of the spaces that I enter, thinking about it in my own student organizations, thinking about it when, you know, we're working at NC Casa and thinking about nonprofit settings, and thinking about how to decentralize so that, you know, we can center more folks into spaces, and thinking about how to include more folks into decentralized spaces rather than the spaces that we know to be, again, hierarchical. And as someone mentioned in the chat, that hierarchical structure can be really oppressive to folks. So moving away from that has been a really important lesson for me.
Yeah, I know that out of all of these lessons, just so that, you know, I'm not just reading them, one of the other ones that's really impactful for me is remembering that anyone is capable of perpetuating harm or abuse. So it's up to each of us to do work to reduce that harm and to take accountability when we cause harm. I think that's an important part of the conversation. It's so easy for us in thinking about transformative justice to think about other people that we want to take accountability without kind of looking at things we need to take accountability for. And I know one of the things that I've learned in some of the trainings I've done with Mia Mingus on transformative justice is that if you taking accountability is like building a muscle. And when you start lifting, you don't want your first lift to be like a deadlift of a ton of weight. You want to start with the little things so that you can build those muscles and make that practice a part of your everyday life. So if you cause a small harm to somebody, reach out and find out how you can make repair, take accountability, own what you've done. I know Mia Mingus has a great workshop on how to make an apology that I loved and learned so much from. So remembering that any of us, there's not good people, bad people, harm doers, survivors. There's like all of us who are messy and complex. And so in practicing taking accountability in workspaces, in student groups, in whatever circles we're in, we both build that muscle in ourselves and also set a model for other people to realize they can do that too. That was another lesson that came up for me.
Exactly. And I think, just as my perspective as a young person, another lesson that I found really important is just this idea of creating new outcomes and being creative and giving oneself the authority to think outside of what we're so normalized and socialized to think. And as someone who is young, as I mentioned, like, I feel like in school, you know, I'm definitely wanted to study, and my priority is definitely like thinking about grades and all those things, but I never even really considered myself to be like an author of something or a creator, or that I too could have a place at the table, or I too could have a voice in these spaces and actually contribute something. And so I think lifting all of ourselves to realize our own capabilities and values, and understanding that just because things are the way they are now, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily right just because they're normalized. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have the capability to change them. And I think that if we realize that we do, then we should. And so that's one other lesson that I've really taken away from this whole project.
Thank you, Shireen. That's really interesting. And I, as a young person too, I also thought the same thing. I never thought that I could be at the table or create something or do anything like that. But I think one thing that I'm also was learning throughout this process, and thinking about like the next steps for like where I want to be after college, is wanting to have an inclusive and uplifting work environment that fosters growth, appreciation, mutual respect, as well as brilliance. And I feel like Christy definitely created an environment for us this summer that allowed us to grow. And I learned so much about myself, and I learned so much about like what I want and what I expect from like a work environment, and also what I want to have a work environment that also is invested in my growth and appreciates me and fosters my brilliance also. And so I think that was something that didn't really think about before, and I didn't really know necessarily like what I was looking for in a work environment or what I was looking for the next steps. And now I think I definitely have a better understanding of what I would want for that, and being able to think about work as not just as another part of my life, but also a part of my life that should also contribute to my growth.
Thank you. I think I just wanted to, before we pass it back over to Tori, say this has been wonderful. Doing this work with Shireen and Mantia is amazing. They are brilliant. We are doing some additional trainings through NC CASA's Training Institute, and we are open to proposals for them to come and kind of just like brainstorm with you in your work. And so we have more information about that at emergentspace.org. Thanks, y'all. I'll pass it back to Tori.
Thank you, Mantia. Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, Christy. You all are getting so much appreciation in the chat for this web conference being a breath of fresh air. Folks are recognizing, Mantia and Shireen, your brilliance, your passion, and how appreciative we all are to have you in this space with us. And Christy, thank you so much for bringing these two brilliant folks into our community and into our spaces. We are so grateful for you today. Mo, do you want to add anything as we close out today's web conference?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, thank you. This is really, it's so great. It's so wonderful. And I think the thing that you were talking about, Mantia, really just struck me as a person who's been in this field and in this movement for a while, is like how important it is for us to like really, really right now do some dreaming and imagining and real changes to make a field and a movement where you are recognized and where you are counted. And I hear so many instances of our spaces not being emergent and not really being what we're talking about here. And I just feel like it's such a reminder that we have the responsibility to make these changes and make it a field that people really want to be in and really feel valued and included. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, and just, yeah, this is so cool.
Thank you.
The chat is going wild. Everybody's like, thank you, thank you, thank you. You'll have to like read it back. It's really great. Oh, I see here's some NSVRC information. The slide before that was some Prevent Connect information. You can contact us. If you liked this web conference, you probably will like the other ones. So be on the lookout in your email. You'll get information about this recording where you can have the slides and the text chat and, revisit this whole thing. And then there will be more coming up as well. And Tori just put a link in the chat. It's the page where you can go to get the information about the web conference series. So the recordings will be there too. If you're like, this is the best, I need to watch it with my teammates, I need to send it to someone I know at the CDC, I know someone was talking about that, I need to share it with my supervisor, you can do all of that too.
Thank you, Mo, and thank you again to Mantia, Shireen, and Christy. We are at our time together today, but I don't think this is the last time we'll be talking with each other and interacting with each other. So thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to Mo and our friends at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Thank you to all of our participants and attendees. So grateful that you all were here today. And also thank you to our friends at Aberdeen Captioning for providing closed caption for this web conference. This concludes today's web conference. Take care, everyone. Thank you.